Cassadaga resident who went missing 4 years ago. Her body was discovered in a hidden underground workshop where her limbs had been dismembered and then reattached to form a gruesome human marionette.
Director Anthony de Blasi brings us Cassadaga, and this one stars Kelen, Coleman and Louise Fletcher. Now, de Blasi, I think, is probably most well known for his movie The Last Shift, which he has actually remade in 2023 as Malum, a movie I've yet to see yet, but I'm hoping to see at some point this year. So Cassadaga is a 2011 movie, which is kind of a both serial killer movie and a haunting movie. So it focuses on this young woman who we see at the beginning of the movie is deaf, and she has lost her parents at some point in the past. So it's just her and her younger sister. But her younger sister is tragically killed in the beginning of the movie in a car accident. And this sends our character into a kind of a spiral of depression, as you'd probably expect. But she seems to have a saving grace when there is a prestigious school in Florida that has some connection to her mother, offers her a place as a teacher within this kind of school, this kind of art teacher. So she accepts and ends up kind of going to this particular school, and there she meets a kind of a hunky guy and all this, and you know, nice kind of kids and everything, seemingly nice accommodation. But one evening she's out with her kind of new boyfriend, and they decide to go for a spirit medium, and she ends up kind of has this kind of spirit attached to her, which is the spirit of this woman who is seemingly something is really bad happened to her. At the same time, there seems to be a serial killer whose modus operandi is pretty sick. He likes to dismember his victims whilst they are still alive, and then kind of reattach their limbs and kind of plays around with them like a kind of marionette doll. What'll happen? Well, you have to watch the movie and find out. So if you're a fan of de Blasi's work, you know he doesn't kind of shy away from violence or gore. And there is a good amount of that within the movie as well. In fact, the movie's quite packed. There's a lot here. So one thing I would say in the plus column here, there's a lot going on in this film. I mean, for a start, you've got a protagonist who's deaf, so that gives a certain kind of unique perspective compared to a lot of other movies. You've got, you know, her dealing with the loss. You've got her fledgling romance with this kind of new guy and her relationship with his daughter. You've got her relationship with kind of Louise Fletcher's character and kind of her creepy kind of son. Not to mention you've got this kind of like this supernatural element with this kind of ghost who is quite aggressive in its own right and seems to be somewhat antagonistic on itself. And obviously you've got the serial killer kind of slasher element to it as well. So there's a lot of things kind of going on in this movie. So I don't think you'd get bored in this one. I think the pacing is pretty kind of like, you know, relatively kind of, you know, well paced because there's so much going on. It's not a particularly massively long film really, but it's got a lot of things that it's trying to kind of balance, and as such, you know, you never really are sort of spending too much time with any one particular kind of sequence. So in that respect, it's kind of like got a lot going on to keep you kind of entertained. I think one of the kind of the key things for me is I found our central character very likeable. The actress here does a good job of making a likeable, believable character who seems vulnerable but kind of strong at the same time, and makes her extremely personable. Now the character is deaf, and I think the results of that are a little mixed. I think sometimes she does a good job of portraying that this character is deaf. Other times she doesn't really seem deaf, I have to be honest. So I think her performance though overall was kind of very good. It's quite well filmed, and the actual killer itself I think has a very kind of disturbing MO. You know, having these kind of characters having been displayed like dolls and things like that, and we get a bit of backstory with him. And it has, I mean, this was a 2011 movie. There's a kind of a transgender element involved here, and this was kind of really before the sort of transgender kind of movement, if you like, really became more mainstream. So it's an interesting one to kind of go back and have a look at. It's not the first serial killer or slasher that's kind of been, you know, worn women clothes. Obviously Psycho, for example, but there's a bit more involved in this one. He even mutates himself, you might say. So yeah, it's pretty good. And our ghost scenes as well. This ghost is pretty horrifying to look at, with full of wounds and rotting flesh and stuff. So the horror elements here are quite in your face, quite kind of like graphic to a certain degree, and the idea of the serial killer is quite kind of disturbing. Now, when it's all said and done, it's the actual plot here is probably one you've seen a few times before. You know, a spirit kind of trying to reach out to try and get a living person to try and get justice for them ultimately, but can't really communicate in a way that isn't kind of terrifying. So it's not a particularly original movie, but it's kind of one you've seen plenty of times and can get invested in. And there's a reasonable amount of kind of gore, which is done to a kind of good effect. And I was kind of looking, certainly in the dismemberment scenes, and thinking they're done pretty well. And I don't think they kind of look, you know, cheesy and look pretty kind of realistic. What doesn't work for me, I think one of the issues that I have with this film is it has so much going on. It's trying to kind of juggle so many elements. Two kind of like antagonistic kind of horror elements, a romantic element, the fact that our protagonist is deaf. It's kind of like spinning a lot of plates and ends up being a jack of all trades but master of none is the best way I would describe it. So it kind of touches a lot of things, but I never really feel we get a huge amount of development in any one particular area. Like the serial killer who dismembers these kind of victims and displays them and plays around with them would have been a good enough kind of antagonist for a film on its own without the kind of the ghost element to it. Because I don't really feel we ever really get to know much about that character. We get an interesting kind of backstory, but we only really ever see him with one victim outside of a little bit of a flashback. So it's kind of like you feel like you don't really sort of see much of that particular kind of character. And therefore he feels a little underdeveloped, as does the kind of the ghost at the kind of the same time. These elements are there, and I think visually speaking they're pretty well done, but it just doesn't kind of feel like you've got the complete kind of package to a certain degree. And that's true of a lot of aspects of this film. I don't think any of these aspects are done badly, but it's just kind of, you feel like you've only got half the story or half what it could have been to a degree. I was a little confused with the serial killer because it does seem to have a kind of supernatural ability which is never explained. He seems to be able to kind of throw his voice and even imitate like perfectly like kind of like other voices, including like female voices, and make them sound like they're coming from a different kind of like area to kind of confuse his victims. I didn't really understand why that was happening, if I'm honest. It didn't really, there's no explanation. He just does it. So that was a little odd. I thought it was some type of supernatural element, but it's never explained. And then obviously we have this spirit kind of medium where at the beginning where our main character is trying to contact her dead sister, and again this other kind of ghost ends up kind of just butting in and kind of attaching itself, and it's like, well, how has that happened? You know, she's meant to have contacted specifically her sister, but it just seems this other ghost has gone like, no, I'm getting in first, and that kind of thing. So there's some elements here that I feel were a little undeveloped. I have to say some of the supporting characters, including love interest, was a little weak. Seemed a little bit kind of generic. I've seen this actor a few times. I don't know. He didn't really kind of strike me as particularly kind of sincere. If we're being completely kind of honest. So, you know, there's a few issues where I feel it just detracts a little bit, but overall it's an enjoyable movie. It's an enjoyable, well put together horror film that I feel is a little bit kind of, doesn't quite add up to the sum of its parts to a certain degree, but it's still worth a watch. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.